So Francisco Migoya is one of the top pastry chefs of this country with an impressive resume from the River Cafe in Brooklyn to Veritas to the French Laundry. Blending his background in art with his passion in food, he had dedicated his career to improving the craft, running the kitchens, teaching the next generation at CIA, and now pushing the boundaries of food at the Modernist Cuisine. His experience and knowledge are also expressed in his cookbooks, Frozen Desserts, The Modern Cafe, and The Elements of Dessert, which have all won numerous awards and is a must for any food professional. His most recent achievement, The Modernist Bread, is a 5-volume, groundbreaking book on bread, which has won many cookbook awards, most notably from the James Beard Foundation and many others. It is my honor to welcome a true pioneer in the field, Francisco Migoya.
Thank you. All right, thanks. All right, so without further ado, we have 27 minutes. So I'm going to try to distill 4.5 years of my life in the next 27 minutes. So yeah, I got the card that was, is the future of printed cookbooks in jeopardy? Certainly hope not, because that would mean I wouldn't have a job. So we talk so much about Instagram and all this stuff, and I think the problem with it, as well as when you're just looking at all these pictures, is that you just don't get the full picture. But sometimes the information that is repeated over and over and over again is not true. There are a few things where that is actually truer than with bread. There are so many misconceptions, there are so many myths, there's so many things that people think are correct that are actually not. And part of it is because bread is such a staple of life. It's been with us since humanity has been humanity. And so there's a lot of like myth and a lot of folklore behind it. And the thing is that sometimes that folklore works, but sometimes it doesn't. So that's why we took a deep dive 4.5 years to produce this book. So here's a quick intro. You can actually order it now. So that's, in a nutshell, what we sought out to do. And actually, it's 2,642 pages, not 2,500. But who's counting, right? It's actually bigger than our first book, so that's something that I'm very proud of. Our first book was 2,500 pages. So this year, we're coming out with our French, German, and Spanish editions, which I'm very happy about, especially the Spanish one. For personal reasons, but this is fall of this year. This is my team. This is my kitchen team. That's my boss in the middle, Nathan Mervold. He's kind of like, I would say, the mastermind behind it all. Obviously, he finances the whole thing, but a lot of people think like he's in the kitchen working with us all day, and nothing's further from the truth than that. He comes up with all of the experiments and the ideas and so forth. And I execute them along with my team. We're a total of between 25 and 26 people that work for Modernist Cuisine. It's a total of 5 volumes. These are them. The first volume is History and Fundamentals. The second one is Ingredients. The third, Techniques and Equipment. And then we have 2 volumes of recipes, plus a kitchen manual, which is basically so you don't have to lug the entire book into the kitchen because it's quite heavy. So the recipe manual is pages. They're waterproof and so forth, so if you get anything on them, it's easy to wipe away. So our approach, I'm not going to, you can read these for yourselves, but our approach is basically to find answers through experimentation and science to dispel myths. It is this that really pushes what we do and how we work on a daily basis. It does seem that there is a little bit of fear by some not just consumers, but a lot of professionals, that science is very complicated and science is very hard to understand, where in fact it isn't, and in fact it helps you make a much better product if you understand what's happening behind it. So I find that what we try to do is basically act as translators between the language of science and just regular language, so that people can in fact understand the science behind how ingredients work, ingredient functionality and such. We do a lot of research for our bread book. We performed 1,500 experiments. So if you think of that in context of, it was in a period of 3 years that we performed the experiments. It's about 500 experiments a year. You have 500 experiments. You don't work 365 days a year. So that's a lot of work to get done. And to get it done right, you have to be very organized, and you have to really make sure that your approach is going to be accurate, and you're going to find answers in the way that you're performing your experiments. We share. I mean, that's a big thing, right? I mean, sharing is where we're talking about. So that was part of the conversation earlier. It's like some people don't share. For us, it's important to share. For me, it always has been important to share, and that's why initially I wrote 3 books on pastry, because that sort of information didn't exist. It existed in sporadic articles. It existed in chefs' minds, and it wasn't written down. It existed in publications in foreign languages. So I wanted to have something that my students could utilize when I was teaching at the Culinary Institute of America, but also professionals. Yeah, we make big books. I think that's an understatement. So one of the things that I want to talk about is one of these things that is repeated over and over again, that the best bread was in the past. That we need to go back to making bread like they used to make bread. And I can tell you with 100% certainty that bread in the past used to suck. It was, and the way, how do we know this? So what do we hear? We hear, oh no, the bread in the old country, the bread like my Nana used to make, and she would knead it with her hands, and she would mill her own flour, and it was just so good. And there was all of these things that we hear about that it's like, bread now is terrible, bread should be like it was in the past. The thing is, you have to understand how to interpret that. Grocery store bread is terrible, but bread now, as you see it in bakeries, you go to Tartine, you go to Levan, you go to anywhere, those are really good breads. And those are breads that you would have never been able to make bread like that in the 1910s, right? So what did we do? We sought out a bunch of historic recipes. We went all the way, as far back as we could to Roman times. Pliny the Elder was, if you've never heard of him, he's a fascinating character because he basically took it upon himself to write an encyclopedia for everything that was known during that time, which is Roman times. And so he wrote about everything, including bread. And so they have some recipes in there for bread, even like how to start a sourdough starter. And we found recipes from there up until the Renaissance. These recipes were very ambiguously written. Very few of them actually had amounts. They would say, for example, add enough water, or mix until it's done. There was a lot of that information, but also there were certain grains that just don't exist anymore. There were also different measures of weight that nobody uses anymore. So we had to find what those conversions were and equivalences and so forth. Bread in the past used to have a different purpose. It was a different reason why you ate bread. In fact, you probably just ate bread. That was what you ate, and that was where you got everything that you needed nutrition-wise. We don't do that now. I mean, right now you have bread maybe 2 or 3 times a week. If that, some people avoid it completely. But it's not a staple of your diet. It's not something that you go to for, to feel full. Where in the past it used to be that. So what you had was very dense breads. You had breads that would be very unpopular now, right? We like to see that big open crumb now. I mean, that's like again, on Instagram, if you follow any artisan bakers, the shot is like the loaf of bread cut in half, and the big open crumb, and that's like the, I was going to use a very vulgar term, but it's the shot that matters. You get it. So it's a shot that matters. Where this bread was supposed to last for days. In fact, it was supposed to last if you were going on a journey across the ocean. The bread was supposed to last you however long that journey took. Can you imagine that? The bread is 3 weeks old and you're still eating it. But again, it had a different role, and it also had a different cost. If you were the average person in France in the 1850s, you would probably spend half your salary on bread. Can you imagine doing that now? Imagine if half your paycheck went to buying bread. It would probably be a lot of bread now, but still, it's a significant amount of bread. And some people got paid in bread, so that's why it's called, in some places it's called money bread. So anyway, this is one of my favorite pictures. It was really cool to put together, but and there were a few that we actually deemed were pretty decent, so we actually have those recipes in our book. There's some things that we don't know about bread, and I'm not going to quiz you. I'm not going to quiz you here, but I'm going to make some assumptions because I made the same mistake. The assumptions I made was that before I started any research on this book is that baguette was a very old bread, and that ciabatta was made by the Romans, right? And I was very wrong. I was very wrong because there were certain breads that didn't exist after World War I. I mean, before World War I. Namely, panettone. Baguette made an appearance in the 1920s. Think of it in terms of the fact that baguette isn't even 100 years old, right? But this one really took me by surprise. 1982. And the way we know it with that sort of accuracy is because there's an actual patent. The person who invented baguette has a patent on how to make baguette. If you've ever made, ciabatta, if you've ever made ciabatta, you've infringed on that patent, and they're probably going to come after you. So. But this is to say that these sorts of breads could not have been made with very tough grains. They couldn't have been made with very dark flours. You need to have the whitest of the white flour to get these breads to actually work. Which brings me to ancient grains, where there's a big push for using ancient grains. But one of the first things you need to realize is that ancient grains, even if they've, let's say they have been untouched with by any farmer or any mill, they're not the same grain they were 10,000 years ago, because these grains evolve just like we do. And if you don't believe in evolution, that's a different story, but a lot of things go through that evolution, okay? And so if you have sorghum, it might be related to the first sorghum, but it's not the same anymore. But there's a big push for using them because they're supposed to be like unpolluted, unmessed with. There's no, here's something that is very, to me it was also very interesting to find out, is that so many people talk about GMOs in wheat. Wheat has never been genetically modified, ever. And you can quote me on that. It has been bred to adapt to, for I guess making it more efficient for farming and so forth, but it's never been genetically modified. So when you see a loaf of bread that says no GMOs, you can go, duh. It's like getting gluten-free water, right? I mean, that's kind of obvious. Huh? And so here's the thing. Ancient grains, let's say you want to use them because you like their flavor. Fine. I mean, it's not going to jump out of the oven, right? But the thing is that ancient grains don't necessarily make the best dough. And sometimes that means that it doesn't make the best bread. And this is because of its rheological properties, meaning how strong it is, how weak it is, and how well it can form gluten bonds and so forth. So you have here, this is the same loaf of bread made with ancient grains, except one is made with ancient grains, and the other one we just add a little bit of vital wheat gluten. So adding a little bit of gluten gives the flour what it needs in order to form a nice crumb, in order to get us a little bit more volume, a little bit more rise, to give us, to be able to score it and to have just a slightly better bread than if it was 100% ancient grains. And this is why you'll see in a lot of bakeries, they mix ancient grains with like the whitest, strongest wheat flour there is, so that it has a strong backbone, and the other flours are kind of like suspended in that, that net of very strong flour. So this is what we like nowadays, right? You want to see these like big open crumbs. This is very hard to achieve with ancient grains. This is something that you need very strong, very white flour to do. Wait, let me go back a little bit. So I'm so happy to be bringing this up. I don't know why it's skipping, but does water type matter? I'm very happy to bring this up in New York City. Very, very happy. I'm going to piss some people off, and I'm fine with that because we keep hearing that bagels in New York City are the best because of the water. And that was something that even before I tested it, I realized that it was not something that was very, I'm not sure what's going on with this, but it's something that just seemed like it was one of those things like you can only have a good bagel in New York City, and wherever you go in the rest of the country, they're going to be bad because they don't have this, magical water that New York has. And so I've also had really bad bagels in New York City. So what excuses do those bakeries have? So we did a bunch of tests with all these different waters. This is just a fermentation example. But when we did it with bagels, what we had was, we actually had tap water shipped from here. So we can perform a bunch of experiments with that water. And we put it through a texture analyzer. We put it through a machine that's called an extensograph to see if there was any magic in its netting. And the truth is that it comes down to how you execute the recipe. So I'm sorry, your water is fine, but it doesn't make any special bagels happen. So, what else did we do? We did some tests with sourdough, in which, by this we mean the sourdough starter. So it's there's a tradition for utilizing raisin water for making your sourdough starter, in which you take raisins and you inoculate water with the raisins, because raisins have yeast on top of them. If you see that white powder on raisins, that is yeast. Yeast is a very interesting microorganism because it's everywhere. It's here. It's all over the place. It's different kinds. The stuff that you're going to find in here is not the same stuff that you're going to find in wheat fields. Why? Because the yeast that is here likes to consume things that are here. The yeast that is in a wheat field likes to consume things that are in a wheat field. So it's very specialized to its environment and what it eats. So how is a yeast that likes to eat the sugar in the raisins going to have anything to do with eating any sort of starch? And so it doesn't. So what these videos show, the first one was just raisin water, inoculated raisin water and flour. The one in the middle, we took that raisin water and we pressure cooked it for 60 minutes. If you pressure cook anything for 60 minutes, there's not going to be any living being in there at all. So I'm not sure what's going on. So why did the one that had all of the dead yeast in it move faster than the one that had supposedly all of the raisin yeast in it? And the reason is because what you did when you pressure cooked those raisins and the water is you helped to break down the sugars that were in the raisins, and you made it more readily available for the yeast that was in the flour. So the best approach for us, the easiest, is going to be to just mix water and flour. So if you ever are thinking of starting a sourdough starter, just mix water and flour equal parts, let it sit 5 days, you're going to start seeing some life forming in there. So, and the fact is that some people say that, oh, I can taste the raisins in it. Why would you want to taste raisins in your sourdough? And the fact is that it's absolutely not true. So you think you do, but it really is not happening. So. And so the guy on the way on the right, that is just the water and flour. It's like the turtle and the rabbit, right? So you're gonna see once these guys are like receding, here he comes, So, all right. Steam is Again, I used to think I knew what steam was, and I regret that for a few years at the CIA, I had it all wrong. So, because my thought was that, I'm just going to skip ahead here, that steam makes bread shinier. I was correct on this assessment, but this one really blew me away, which is that steam creates more oven spring, meaning that if you steam bread, it's going to make for a bigger loaf of bread. We tested it and tested it and tested it, and it didn't make any bigger. All it did was make for a shinier crust and a crustier crust, if you will. So it really didn't have anything to do with volume. But I also misunderstood this, which is very important. It's like why steam makes bread crispy. It's one of the things that is important to realize and point out about how the effect on steam in a dough is that steam has this physical property where it likes to go where it's coolest in an oven. It doesn't like to go where it's hottest, because when it goes where it's hottest, it's just going to dissipate. So when we put a dough in the oven and we inject it with steam, what's going to happen is that steam is going to surround the dough like a glove. But then what it's going to do is it's going to get the surface to boiling point, 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So these little bubbles that you see on the surface, I guess this doesn't have a light? No? Okay. The bubbles that you see on the surface, they basically, they fill up with the steam, they expand, and then they pop, but then they go to the bubble directly below it, and then they do the same thing. And it just keeps going and going and going. It's this chain effect that starts on the outside and makes its way to the center of the dough. Once it reaches the center of the dough and there's no more steam to form, then it's going to start to make its way out of the dough. This has a name, it's called a heat pipe effect. But what I found very interesting about this is that, and we found some papers that alluded to this, is that if you have all of these little bubbles in your dough and they've all popped, you effectively have one bubble inside your dough. They're all connected, but in reality you can think of it as this, that your dough has only...
Sorry, can't turn it off.
You can mute that if you wanted to. Okay, so this is basically the effect of steam on the surface of dough. So I don't know how many people here have made bread, but I know that a couple of times I've made dough and a couple of times I've overproofed it. And it's the most frustrating thing, right? Because you've made this dough, it takes time. Dough is inexpensive, but the most expensive part about making dough and bread is your time. So you see this deflated blob and you throw it in the trash or compost if you're in Seattle. And you maybe don't start over again right away. You have to build it back, the emotion of making bread and the excitement before you give it another shot. And so one of the things we thought about doing was, well, what happens, let's intentionally overproof dough and see if we can bring it back to life. It was an intuitive thing that might work, but we weren't positive because what happens when you overproof dough is you have all of the yeast producing CO2, which is why that CO2 is basically going to make the bread bigger, the dough bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a point where it deflates because the bubble walls become too weak, and so that's why your dough collapses. And there's also this strong alcohol aroma, and that's because of lactic acid bacteria. So you have CO2 and ethanol. So it doesn't smell good, it's deflated, it's better to throw it in the trash. But the truth is that if you take this dough out of its basket that it was proofing in, and you reshape it, and you proof it again, it comes back. It was incredible to see because the thought is that the yeast already ate all the sugar in here. This dough is, it's going to have that ethanol aroma to it. But effectively, by degassing it, what you did is you made those bubble walls strong again by compressing them and reshaping the dough. And you expelled all of the CO2 and the ethanol that was in there. So it worked the first time, and then we said, let's do it again. Let's overproof it again a second time. And it worked. Wow. 10 times. I will tell you, though, that if you overproof your dough 10 times, you should probably look at a different career path. or get a timer, one of those things to work. So we call it CPR. It's a cheesy acronym that is, obviously it's cardiopulmonary resuscitation, but we call it carbohydrate protein resuscitation. Just we had to make it work, I guess. What else we got? How much time do I have? 3? So this is our next project, pizza. We've been working on this for 1.5 years. And in fact, next week we're going to be, this coincided with the trip that my boss is coming out for on Tuesday, Nathan, and we're going to be visiting a bunch of pizzerias in New York, New Jersey, as part of the research for the book. We'll tell you, a lot of people say, oh, that's so cool, and it is cool. But after you visited your 5th pizzeria in one day, you want to die, I promise you. So we're going to be doing this for 4 days. Last year we went to Italy 3 times. And we went to Buenos Aires, that has a huge Italian immigrant population and a lot of pizzerias. We also went to Sao Paulo, which blew my mind that pizzerias were a big thing in Sao Paulo. There's 6,000 pizzerias in Sao Paulo, and they have a very distinct style of pizza. And so this book, we're looking at least a couple more years before it comes out. But that's what we've been actively working on, and we've utilized a lot of what we learned in our bread book to apply to this. So I don't think we have Q&As. It's just to show you guys what we're doing. I do have a pastry talk at 2 o'clock today, so hopefully I see you guys there. But anyway, I hope this information was useful to you and excites you about making bread. It certainly excites me about making bread, so thanks.